Okay. All right, so we'll say good morning. Let's begin. We are picking up on Daf Chof Dalid Amud Aleph. And remember, again, we are in the midst of the raging machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon as to whether or not one is permitted to purchase an animal from an akum in order to go ahead and use it for carbonic purposes. So the Gemara says as follows. So remember, again, the Gemara wanted to bring a proof from the episode of Dama ben Nesina. So remember again, Dama ben Nesina, we saw the Gemara actually brings it down in the context of Hilchos Kibud Av Va'im. That Dama ben Nesina had to go ahead and wake up his father, despite the fact that he stood to make a windfall Avnei Miluim that they wanted to purchase from him. So we'll say, see over here, so the Gemara wanted to suggest that at the end of the day, you see from here that you can in fact purchase objects, even consecrated objects from an akum. So the Gemara says, no, Avnei Miluim. So we'll say, take a look. Aleph, 3 lines in, last one on line. Avnei, so the Gemara says, Avnei, Zara, Avnei Shem Hivsika Inyan. So the Gemara says it was different. Why? Because the stones ultimately, again, they wanted to purchase them. We're not Avnei Miluim, Avanim for the ephod. So we'll say the idea for the Avanim by the ephod, the Gemara talks about suggests that they are mentioned as a self-standing item in the pasuk, and perhaps that's why they can be purchased from the akum. So the Gemara says, Avnei Shem Hivsika Inyan. Avnei Miluim Ksiv Dahada Arve. But 1 second, but the pasuk later on says Avnei Miluim, which are both say the Avnei Miluim. Remember again with the other precious stones that were used in the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. Ksiv Dahada Arve, because they both say ultimately again. Remember they are included. They are included once again in the Va'od Katani Seifa L'Shana Acheres Nodalo Para Aduma Be'etru. So we'll say, remember again, the story of Dama ben Nesina continues. And the Dama ben Nesina story continues is that the following year, there was a Para Aduma born in his flock. Nichnesu Chachmei Yisrael Etzlo. So we'll say, the Chachamim came back to Dama ben Nesina. Amar Lahem, he said to them, Yodea ani bachem, I know, she'im ani mevakish mikem kamamon sheba'olam, atem nosnin li. I know that what? I know that at the end of the day, if I were to ask of you any amount of money in the world, you would give it to me. In other words, that I know that I could ask any amount for this paradum. Now I'm only going to ask you for what? I'm only going to ask you ultimately again for the amount of money that I lost because I was mechabed my father. I'm only going to ask you to recoup the loss for the lost opportunity to go ahead and sell the precious stones. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that Lamaisa, that he went ahead and they were able to buy the paraduma from him. So we'll say this is a contradiction to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that you can't purchase a paraduma, you can't purchase any sacrificial animal from an akum, to which the Gemara says, no, hasam al yidei tadrei Yisrael zabun. We'll say that case was different. Why? Because who were they buying it from? They were buying it from a Jewish merchant. Take a look at Rashi. Tagre Yisrael. Sirsre Yisrael lakcha mishalo mina oveko chavim latzmo. The chazru machol letzibor. So we'll say the case over here would have been where there was a Jewish merchant who was going, a broker, who was going to buy it from the akum, and the Yisrael, the Jews were going to buy it ultimately again from the broker. In other words, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, the prohibition ultimately is to buy directly from the akum. But if there is going to be a Jewish broker who is going to buy from the akum, then ultimately again the Beis Hamikdash could purchase from the broker. So also I just point out, Rabbi Shmuel Silber has a beautiful ha'ara on this. He says, you see from here, as much as the Gemara goes ahead and brings a raya to the incredible extent that one must go to for Kibud Avva'im from Dama ben Nesina, but you see the difference between the way a Jew and an Akum performs a mitzvah. If you'll notice again, when the rabbis come back to Dama ben Nesina to purchase the Paraduma, so what does he say? I could charge you any amount of money, but I'll only charge you what? Only charge you what? That which I lost for the performance of the mitzvah. You see, in Dama ben Nesina's eyes, as much as he went in and performed the dramatic mitzvah, he suffered a loss. He suffered a loss, Rabbi say. And what he said is, I need to recapture the amount that I lost. See, Rabbi said, at the end of the day, herein lies the distinction. That when we have the opportunity to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rabbi say, even if there's a financial cost, it may be a cost, but it's never chas v'shalom, a loss. Anything that it costs us to perform a mitzvah, is a great opportunity, is a great zuchos, is a great mitzvah. Might be a cost, but never a loss. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Eliezer l'chayish l'revia. The boss says, remember again, so what we're holding right now is that Rabbi Eliezer's issue when it comes to purchasing an animal from an akum for sacrificial purpose, Rabbi say, is not an issue of bestiality, but rather what? An issue of a gzer sakosov. Remember again, he's darshaning from the pasuk of yikchu to ultimately be read as yakichu. So yakichu means you can only purchase it from an akum and not, from a Yehudi, from a Jew, and not from anyone else. So the Gemara says, is that true? That Rabbi Eliezer is not choshesh for bestiality? I bought Tanya, but there was an episode. The Gemara quotes a brayso. Amru lo Rabbi Eliezer, ma'aseh v'lakchu mina oved kochavim v'dama shmo. So there was an episode where they bought a paraduma from an oved kochavim, and the oved kochavim's name was Dama. Va'amrile Ramat shmo. Others say his name wasn't Dama, it was Ramat. Amar len Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Amar len Rabbi Eliezer, Misham Raya. So Rabbi Eliezer says about that story, is that a Raya that you could purchase a sacrificial animal from an akum? That case was different. Why? Hayu Mishamrim Osa Misha Shenolda. We'll say in that case, they were watching that animal from the time that it was born. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer says, the reason that they were permitted to purchase that paraduma from an akum was why? Because they are watching it from the time that it was born to ensure that what? To ensure that ultimately, again, no one would engage with an act of bestiality. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Tarti Islay. Rabbi Eliezer says ultimately has two issues. We'll say one is ultimately kicha, v'chayesh tami l'revia. So we'll say indeed Rabbi Eliezer has ultimately again two potential issues at play. There is the issue of kicha, that you can't purchase it ultimately again from an akum, which I will say we could resolve ultimately with the presence of a Jewish broker. And there is also the issue of revia. There is also the issue of bestiality, but the issue of bestiality ultimately can be dealt with the fact that they kept a watchful eye on the animal from the time that it was born. Amar Mar, Yisrael Hayimishomерnos and Mishoshin Olda. So you're telling me now that the way that they ensured that the animal was not a victim of bestiality was because they watched it from the time that it was born. Or from the time that it's born, you know that it's red. So ultimately, again, they put it, whatever they did, whatever they had to do, they put it under constant watch. They put it in an enclosure. They sequestered it from human contact. Whatever it was, that they were able to ensure that Lamaisa, again, it was not the victim of bestiality. But maybe there's another issue. Maybe when the mother was pregnant with the paraduma, the mother engaged in bestiality. And I will say, you'll say, so what? So we'll say that impacts, if the mother engaged in bestiality, as we're about to see, that impacts the vlad. How does it impact the vlad? The Amar Rava, vlad hanogachas aser. Ultimately, again, I will say that vlad hanogachas is aser. Now, what does this mean? So if you look at Rashi, vlad hanogachas, para shenagcha yisrael kishimu beres umeis, vlada pasal karban. We'll say if you have an animal that gored another animal, and the another person, right? And that goring animal was pregnant at the time of its goring, so its offspring becomes invalidated for use as a karban. You can't use the offspring for karban. What I will say, Vlad hanogachas aser. The Gemara says why? Because he uvlada nagcho. Because I will say we view the ubar. We view ultimately again we view the offspring as a party to the act of the goring. So the Gemara says, so Vlad hanir va'as asura asur. But say so too over here what? So too if you have an animal that engaged in bestiality and the animal was pregnant at the time and engaged in this bestiality, asur. Why? Because who uvlada nirvu. So we'll say we view ultimately whatever happens ultimately again to the mother is considered to have occurred to the offspring as well. So if the mother gored, then ultimately the offspring is considered to be a goring animal. If the mother engaged in bestiality, then what? Then ultimately again we view the offspring of having engaged in bestiality as well. To which the Gemara says, so at the end of the day, it's very nice that you say that in this case of the paraduma that was born to the akum, you watched it from the time that it was born. That's fine. That tells me that the Vlad itself never directly engaged in active bestiality. But what does it not help with? The possibility that maybe the mother engaged in active bestiality while it was pregnant. And if that's the case, then again, the offspring would be invalidated. To which the Gemara says, Ema Yisrael Hayumishamrin also Mishashinotzra. That the mother was under watch from the time that she conceived. From the time that she conceived, ultimately, again, she was guarded to make sure that she didn't engage in active bestiality. But maybe the mother engaged in bestiality before she conceived. Because we learned in the following Mishnah, all those that are unfit to be offered up on the Mizbeach, their offspring is mutter. V'tani Allah, and ultimately, again, we learned about this. Rabbi Eliezer Oser. Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Osai, that ultimately, again, the offspring will be Oser. Hanicha l'Rava, Da'amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, Machlokes Kishen, Irvu Kishen, Mukdashin. So we'll say this makes sense according to Rava, who says that the Machlokes is only when what? When the animal engaged in bestiality, when it was already Mukdash. Aval Kishen Chulin, but if the animal engaged in bestiality while it was still Chulin, Divrei HaKol Mutarin. Everyone will agree that the animal is that the offspring is still mutar. El Rafuna Bar Chinna the Amar Rav Nachman. Machlokes Kishenirvu, that the machlokes is ultimate. Machlokes Kishenuv Kishen Chulin. That the machlokes is when they engaged in bestiality while it was still Chulin. Aval Kishen Mukdashin Divrei HaKol Asurin. But if the animal was mukdash already, everyone will agree that it is asur. Ma'ikal Memar. To Rabbi say ultimately again, what is there to say? Then we'd have to be concerned, Rabbi say, for the fact that what? That even if the mother engaged in bestiality before the mother was pregnant, that would still potentially invalidate the para aduma offspring. To which the Gemara says, Oima Yisrael hayu mishamrin osal ima misha shenotzra. Alright, so it's a very dramatic answer. So say that the Yisrael was watching the mother from the time that the mother was conceived. In other words, from the time that the mother of the para aduma was conceived, Rabbi say, then what? She was already under the watchful eye of the Yisrael. And therefore we ensured that Lamais, again, she never engaged in bestiality. But one second, maybe the mother of the mother engaged in bestiality. To which the Gemara says, okay, that's enough already. By the way, I just want to point out, Lamais, again, it's a concern. It could invalidate the animal. To which the Gemara says, at some point in time, we just have to draw the line. So the Mirasar, even Rabbi say, in Rabbi Eliezer's model, so the Maisa, again, even in Rabbi Eliezer's model, so at the end of the day, we'll be choshesh for the mother, we won't be choshesh ultimately again for the mother's mother. But the Maisa Rabbi Eliezer's model, you will have to know, it's not enough just to know the status of the para aduma, but you'll have to actually know the status of the mother of the para aduma as well, in order ultimately, again, to go to Rabbi say, now I want to be clear. Yeah. This is only in the specific case of when they're purchasing the para aduma from an akum. We'll say that's where this concern exists, lagabi bestiality. If we're purchasing the paraduma from the Yisrael, so then these issues or these concerns do not exist. But in Rabbi Eliezer's view, if you're purchasing the paraduma from the akum, one has to know not only the status of the paraduma, so now is the idea that the paraduma has been watched from birth. That's obvious. In Rabbi Eliezer's model, well, I was going to Eliezer. Eliezer's model, you even have to be the mother herself also has to have, quote unquote, we'll call it her pedigree intact in order to ultimately purchase the para aduma from the akum. To which the Gemara says, Amar Mar, Yisrael hayu mishamrin osa mishashinotzra. So we'll say ultimately again, so listen to this. So remember, we'll say this is all in Rabbi Eliezer's model. In Rabbi Eliezer's model, so he said that the Yisrael was watching the mother of the para aduma from the time that she conceived. Now, here's the Avi Shaila. How do you know that she's pregnant with a paraduma, that you're watching the mother? So I mean, let's work backwards. To tell me that you're going to watch the paraduma from the time that it's born, got it. As difficult as that may be, I understand those circumstances. Now you're telling me you're going to watch the mother from the time that she conceives the para aduma in order to ensure that she does not engage in any bestiality. For that would invalidate not only her, the mother, from sacrificial service, but it would invalidate the para aduma even in utero. How do you know that she conceived the para aduma? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. Amrav Kana kos adam ma'avirin lefaneha b'shar sha'ola le'azachar. So we'll say, so let's just take a step back here. We're kind of work backwards. The Gemara says, what's the case? The case over here, I will say, is that in this particular female, right before she is about to mate with the male, or I should say at the time that she's mating, we take a cup of red liquid and we pass it in front of her. And the fact that she sees the cup of red liquid at the time that she's mating, ultimately, again, goes ahead and what? Allows her to conceive the paraduma. So the Gemara says, that's it, right? Meaning that's what it takes to conceive a paraduma. Iachi amai dameha yikarin. We'll say, if that's the case, then why is a para aduma so expensive? In other words, if that's all it takes to create a para aduma, let every single person do that to his animal, and we will have a proliferation of para aduma. Yeah. To which the Gemara says, the Gemara says, no, Hoilush saros postlimba. So we'll say, ultimately, again, understand, the issue is not getting a red cow. The issue is getting a red cow, ultimately, again, that's totally red, without two disqualifying hairs. So we'll say, apparently, there are there were a number of paradumos, right? Paraduma. A number, ultimately, again, of red cows. But remember, again, to be a paraduma, it's not just have to be red, but you can't have even the presence of two black hairs. So that's the issue that comes up. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, I don't understand. So why does this seem to be that this was a case that was happening in the flock, ultimately again, of a Gentile? Or is why can't Jews breed pari aduma as well? Rashi says, does the Yisrael avdila dinachri? So we'll say, so the shaila is, why are we passing the cup of red liquid in front of the Gentile cow, or the akum cow? Why don't we do this for a Jewish cow? To which the Gemara says, Amrav Kahana b'muchzekes. So let's say, remember again, we're talking about, we'll say, that this is about an akum, we'll say, who has a herd, who has a chazaka of being able to breed pare aduma. So we'll say, the idea over here is muchzekes. Look at Rashi, muchzekes, min mishpachos paros hayilu l'dama ben nesina, muchzekes leileit velados adumim ba'avaras kos. So it's about a specific case that happened to be Dama ben Nesina had a chazaka on being able to breed red heifers, red cows. So as I said, the idea over here is that's why they were doing this. So as I said, again, when you put this all together, that's why again it's not easy. It might be easy to find a red paraduma. It's not easy to find ultimately again one without two disqualifying hairs. And Dama ben Nesina apparently again had a chazak of being able to breed these kind of animals. So Yosef Rabbi Ami Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Akil Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha were sitting on the porch of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. And what happened? Pasach Adminav Amar. One of them began saying the following: V'chein Haya Rebbe Lazar Posel Bechol HaKarbanos Kula. So they quoted the sheet of Rebbe Lazar. What does Rebbe Lazar say? Rebbe Lazar said that he would pass with all korbanos. So we'll say Rebbe Lazar said you can't purchase sacrificial animals for any karban from an akum. Why? Rebbe Lazar said because remember. So why? Pasach idach minav amar umayo sivule. So no, what's the answer? What's the answer? So we'll say remember again. Why does Rebbe Lazar not allow the purchase ultimately again of animals from an akum? Because Rebbe Lazar is choshesh v'siyat for a via. All right, so we'll say at the end of the day, Rebbe Lazar is choshesh that the akum engages in bestiality with his animal, and therefore one may not purchase the animal for any sacrificial purpose from an akum. That's paraduma, and that's anything else as well. So my osivule chavroi Rebbe Lazar. So what's Rebbe Lazar's friends' response to him? We'll say they quoted the pasuk from Yeshaya. What does the pasuk say? Kedar yikbitzu lecha. Remember again, the Pasuk also saw this in yesterday's daf as well. Called Son Kedar, which literally means all the sheep of Kedar will be gathered and we will be offered up as karbanos. So we'll say, we assume that what's Son Kedar? Let's see, those are the sheep of Gentiles. And yet, what do we see? We see that what? They're going to be offered up as karbanos, to which the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, that's not a raya. Kulam gerim gerurim heim la'asid lava. We'll say first wide line. This pasuk, we'll say in Yeshaya, is referring to the Messianic era. That the Messianic era, some of the Gentile nations will convert, and then they will offer up karbanos. So we'll say, whose karbanos are we talking about? Whose animals are we talking about over here? Not the animals of Akum, but rather, again, the animals of Gerim. That's why we're permitted to go in and take them. Amar Rav Yosef Mikra, what's the pasuk that supports this? Ki az efoch el amim safa berura. Amar le Abaye, v'dilma me'avodas kachavim hu dahader b'hu. Maybe they're not really converting. Maybe at the end of the day, they're just going ahead and renouncing idolatry. Rashi says, maybe they're just converting, in other words, that they're just renouncing idolatry, but maybe they'll still be engaging in bestiality. In other words, it's two different things. Renouncing idolatry does not necessarily mean that they have an intact code of morality. To which the Gemara says, Amar le Rav Yosef, la'avdu shchem echad ksiv. It says that they're going to worship literally again with one shoulder. The idea being that they're going to worship together, which Rabbi means that it's not just simply idolatry, but rather again they're going to align their lifestyle with that of Klal Yisrael. Rav Papa Masniachi, Rav Zvid Masniachi, Rav Papa taught it this way, and Rav Zvid taught it a different way. V'tarvayu Amri, and I will say they both essentially said the same thing, which was V'chein Haya Rabbi Eliezer Posa B'chalar Kabbalah. So I will say Rabbi Eliezer said, you can't purchase an animal from an akum for any karban. The disqualification is for all karbanos. V'tarvayu Amri. So the Gemara says, Umay osivu leichavro Rabbi Eliezer. And ultimately, again, what did Rabbi Eliezer's friends respond to him? Kol son kedar yikbetzu lecha. Rabbi Eliezer, kulim gerim gerurim heim la'asid lavo. Rabbi Eliezer will say, so it's the same exchange. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you can't go ahead. That son kedar will say is not talking about offerings which come from Gentiles, but rather again those in the son kedar are coming from gerim. Umaykra, what's the pasuk that support this? Ki az efoch el amim safa berura likra kulam b'shem Hashem. Fine, maskif Rav Yosef. The dilma me'avodos kochavim hu dahadripuhu. We'll say it's the same exchange. Maybe they're not converting. Maybe they're just renouncing idolatry, but unfortunately still steeped in immorality. Amar le Abaye la'avdo shchem echad ksiv. Says that they're going to worship together, shoulder to shoulder. Meisvei. So we'll say. So therefore, again, here's where we're holding. Ultimately, again, we still see Rabbi Eliezer on the record as saying that what you cannot purchase sacrificial animals. Ultimately, again, from Ovdei Kochavim. From Ovdei Kochavim. And I will say. Now remember again, there's a shaila as to why Rabbi Eliezer holds that. At first we thought it was because of bestiality. Then we thought Zara Sakasiv. Now kind of we're at the point where we're saying maybe it's both. Maybe it's both. It's Yikhu Yakichu, Zara Sakasiv, plus Chayshin and L'Revia. So we're just trying to bring now a whole series of questions against Rabbi Eliezer. We'll say, listen to this. Another kasha. Let me say. We'll say second to last line. Chavtal Ramad Aleph. Meisvei. Vayomer Moshe. Gam ata titin biadenu zvachim va'olos. Oh, we'll say it's a good kasha. What does Moshe Rabbeinu say to Paro? Not only are we going to leave, but what? You're going to give us karbanos. You, Paro, are going to give us karbanos. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that you can accept a karban from an akum, which the Gemara says, Kol de Matan Torah shiny. It's different, we'll say. That was before Matan Torah. That was before Sanhedrin Revelation. That was before the giving of the Torah. There's a whole, excuse me. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is permitted before Matan Torah that is not permitted after Matan Torah. Shimosh Tashma, both say in Lavikasha, Vayikach Yisra Chosin Moshe, Ola Uzvachim Lelokim. Both say, what does the Torah say? That what? Yisro gave karbanos. Yisro was an akum. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not a problem. Also, why? Yisro nami kodem matan Torah. I will say, Yisro was also before matan Torah. Sani chalaman dama Yisro kodem matan Torah. that works fine according to the Mandama who says that Yisrael comes to Klal Yisrael before Matan Torah. So the Gemara says, Amud Beis, Ella man the Amar, Yisrael la'achar Matan Torah hava, ma'ikra l'meimar. According to the Mandama who says that Yisrael was what? Yisrael was before Matan Torah. What is there to say? Ella Yisrael mi Yisrael zavar. Either also what you have to say is as follows: that Yisrael Bosai didn't bring his own animals, rather what? He purchased, which Bosai makes sense. Makes sense because if Yisrael is making the journey ultimately again from Midyan to Midbar Sinai, he's not bringing his own sacrificial animals, rather he buys them from Jews and therefore ultimately again goes ahead and offers those animals up. So we'll say the Gemara quotes another price. So remember, all of this is in an effort to refute the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is telling me that you can't go ahead and bring a sacrificial animal from an akum. We're just bringing multiple examples of where you can. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Tashma, listen to this. So we'll say, give you a little bit of context over here. Chosh Baruch Hu tells Shaul to go to war against the Amaleki. What does he tell them to do? Tells Shaul to do, wipe out everyone and everything. What does Shaul do? Shaul spares the king, as well as women, children, and we're going to see. Vayomer Shaul, now remember again, Shaul runs into Shmuel, the Navi, and Shmuel says, what is all of this? And Shaul says, oh, we got this from the Amaleki. Asher chamalaham ametav tzon va'bakar amushalim va'akarim va'kolatzon liman zvoach la'Hashem Elokecha. So we brought back the best stuff in order to go ahead and what? Sacrifice to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Suppose say, what do you see from here? What was their intention? To take the animals from Amalek and to offer them up as karbanos. What do you see from here? That you could take akum animals, right, or animals from an akum, and offer them up as a karban. To which the Gemara says, no. My metav. What does it mean ultimately again that they were going to offer up the best of the animals? Demei metav. Both say they were going to take the best animals, sell them, and use the proceeds ultimately to purchase sacrificial animals for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But they were not going to go ahead and what? They were not going to offer up those animals themselves. If that's the case that they're selling off the animals, why can you only sell off the best animals? Sell off any animals. To which the Gemara says, Ki delikbaz alayhen zevina. Because also, remember again, they want liquid assets. So therefore, again, in the interest of being able to transform the livestock into money as quickly as possible, they only spared the best livestock, because the best livestock presumably would sell quickly. Tashma, so we'll say Sinoraya. Tashma, Vayomar Ravna El David. So let's listen to this. This is actually an amazing episode. Remember again, David HaMelech wants more than anything to go ahead and build the Beis HaMikdash. But the Rebbe Shalom tells him explicitly, you are not going to build the Mikdash, for whatever the reason. But what David HaMelech does have the great zchus to what? To purchase the future site of the Beis HaMikdash. Now remember again, at that point in time, Har HaBayis was owned by a man by the name of Aravna HaYevusi. That was his name. It wasn't even Jewish. It was a Jebusite. Right? Aravna HaYevusi. And amazingly enough, if you can imagine this, the site of the Har HaBayis was a threshing floor. It was Aravna's house. It was his backyard. And it was a threshing floor. He used to thresh his wheat there. So what happens? So Vayomer Aravna al David. So David comes to Aravna in order to go ahead and purchase the site. So Aravna says, of course, no fight. Vayomer Aravna al David Yikach. Vayala Adoni Amelech Asatov Be'enei. Right? Ve'es habakar li'ola. And please, let me sell you also my cattle. You could use it as an ola. Va'morigim uklei bakar le'itim. You could take all of my farming utensils and use it as wood. In other words, make a mizbeach for yourself. Use everything as wood. And take my cattle and use it as karbanos. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? What do you see from here? That you could take karbanos, ultimately again, from an akum. Rav Nachman, no. Aravna ger toshav haya. We'll say Aravna was a ger toshav. So we'll say because Aravna was a ger toshav, so we'll say it's actually very interesting that what? Ger toshav will say means that he was a Gentile. But what? He wasn't an akum. They will say, but not only that, so when you become a ger toshav, we'll say, remember again, you agree to live by Noahide laws, which means that you also accept upon yourself a system of morality. So because of that, there was no chashash for Rabbi, no chashash for bestiality by a Ravna, and therefore David HaMelech could have gone ahead and purchased the animals or taken the animals from Ravna and offered them up as a karban. So Gemara just says, by the way, as an aside, my morigim. So remember again, a Ravna offers David the bakar and morigim. What are morigim? Amar ula mita shel turbil. Oh, it's a bed of turbil. Thank you. My mita shel turbil. What is a turbil bed? Iza di korkasa di daishan. It is a goat with teeth that threshes. And Rashi points out over here, this actually wasn't a goat. The morigim, I will say, was a large board, a large, thick board that had small grooves. I will say, that were like teeth. What would you do with this board? You actually would place this board on top of the wheat. The animal would walk on top of the board, and because of the grooves, it would thresh the wheat. So I will say, so therefore, again, it was a wooden utensil. It would have been used ultimately, again, for firewood in this particular story. Amar Rav Yosef Mikra. So we'll say, what's the pasuk that supports this idea? Hinei samtich lemorik charutz chadash ba pipios tadush harim v'tidosh kvos kamos tasim. Fine, may say. So we'll say, so remember again, we're still trying to figure out. Rabbi Eliezer's shita is that lemaisa. Again, you can go ahead and you cannot go ahead and purchase any kind of sacrificial items from an akum. So we'll say we're going to bring another kasha against that. May say, we'll say this is actually a dramatic episode. So remember again, Navi in Shmuel Aleph talks about the idea that Eli's sons went off the derech. Whatever they did, they went off the derech. They make the dramatic mistake of what? Taking the Aron Habris out with them to war against the Plishtim. They lose the battle, Jewish army is decimated, Eli's sons are killed. Remember, this is where Eli hears the news. What happens? He falls off his chair. Actually, again, if you go to Shiloh, the beautiful city of Shiloh, right? This is where, again, all of these events happened. It was the home of Shmuel. It was also the home of the Mishkan. It was ultimately the home of Eli. It's where Eli dies. I will say, what happens? The Aron is taken captive by the Plishtim. I want to say, so remember again, what happens? Everywhere the Plishtim take the Aron, what happens? I will say, there's an incredible outbreak of really, it sounds like hemorrhoids and diarrhea. Otherwise, we'll say that they could, meaning the Plishtim could not withstand the Aron. So what do? They literally put it on a wagon, hitch it to 2 cows, and say, just go, get it out of here. They're both saying that what they really wanted to see was, they've already seen the power of the Aron. What they wanted to see was what was going to happen. Would the Aron make its way back to Eretz Yisrael on its own? So we'll say, so what do? So remember again, sure enough, the Aron makes its way back to Eretz Yisrael on its own. So we'll say, so what happens? When the wagon comes back, the eshaparos ha'elu ola la'Hashem. So we'll say, what did they do? The Jews offered up the paros. They offered up the 2 cows. Ultimately, again, that brought the wagon. They brought it up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They offered it up as an olah. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? They offered up animals which came ultimately again from an akum as a karban. So you see that you could offer up an animal from an akum as a karban. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not a raya. Horas shaya haisa. I will say this was an exception. I will say horas shah means it was a unique ruling. This is not the norm, but they allowed this under these unique circumstances. Look at Rashi. Horas shah nipnei nes shenas al yidin. I will say because of the incredible miracle that happened with these cows, sheviu ha'aron me'atzmon vein ish manhigam vespaneim kalu babayis v'lo ga'achan. So we'll say this is also dramatic. What was so miraculous about this? Well, it was miraculous that the cows made it back on their own. What was also miraculous is they took cows that had young calves. And I will say, under normal circumstances, cows would not leave their calves behind. Yet here they did. So I will say, when Klal Yisrael saw the dramatic miracle, they understood that these animals were consecrated and special as well. And therefore, what did they do? They went ahead and they offered them up as a karban. But it was harash shar. We'll say it was not the norm, but rather, again, it was an exception. Hachanayim Sar will say this is clear. Because if you don't say this, ola nekeva miika. So we'll say normally an ola comes from a male animal, not from a female animal. Cows are obviously female. So the Gemara says, "Umay kushya, dilma babamas yachid." Well, that's not such a kasha. Because we'll say maybe they offered up what? Maybe they offered up these animals, ultimately again, on a private altar. How do we know that ultimately again a female ola is kasher on an individual bama? Shinemar vayikach Shmuel tala chalav echad vayaleu. Excuse me. Vayaleu zachar mashma. The boss say yaleu is lashon of zachar. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak vayala ksiv says vayaleu. But we read it vayalehu, but it could be read also as vayala nikeva. So also you see from here that on a bamas yachid rabosai you could offer up an ola of either gender. You could offer up male or female. So maybe this case is not an exception, but maybe again rabosai this is. Let me take a step back. It is an exception. This is Horah Shabosai. Because when the Jews saw the incredible miracle that happened with these cows, they realized these cows were consecrated. Therefore, they offered them up. They offered them up, even though what? Even though these were animals which came from an akum. So we'll say the fact that they were also female animals offered up as an olah, whereas olas normally male animals. That's not as much of a chiddush. Why? Because it's possible that lemaisa. That this was offered up on Abamas Yachid. And on Abamas Yachid, an individual altar Rabosai, you could offer up olas of either gender. Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabosai, listen to this. Now we're jumping back for just a moment. Rabosai, Rabbi Yochanan is coming along and trying to reconcile the Braisa with the Mishnah. So Rabosai, remember how this whole discussion began? I have a Mishnah that told me that I cannot stable an animal with an akum. Why not? Why not? Bestiality. And then I have a Braisa that says that I am permitted to go ahead and purchase animals from an akum for sacrificial purposes. Which Rabosai tells me what? That I'm not choshesh from bestiality. So remember again, we've been spending all this time. So our last approach to reconciliation was Rabbanan versus Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the opinion who says that you cannot purchase animals from an akum because of choshesh bestiality. The Rabbanan do not subscribe to that. Therefore, the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer, the Braisa, the view of the Rabbanan. Now we're suggesting another approach. Rabbi Yochanan Amar will say Gvul Yeshla. We'll say Gvul Yeshla means there's a framework to this halacha. Pchusa mibaskim oshan ne'akeres. So we'll say if an animal is engaged in bestiality under the age of 3, the act could sterilize the animal. Bas gimoshanim eino ne'akeres. Above the age of 3, Rabosai, even if the animal engages in bestiality, it will not become sterilized. Look at Rashi. Elagvor, sterile. Elagvor yeshla. Pchusim vaskim moshar ne'akeres. Barbas ish v'nichas min avik kochavim b'chayisa. So we'll say, what do we assume? We assume if the animal is less than 3 years old, the avik kochavim is not going to engage in bestiality. Why? Because going back to before, he doesn't want his animal to become sterile. Therefore, what Rabosai? You can purchase an animal for an akum and even use it for sacrificial purposes as long as what? The animal is under 3. However, Aval Bash Shalosh Rashi says, Shuv Einon Ekeres Chashin L'Reviyah. But you may not purchase an animal above the age of 3 from an akum for sacrificial purposes. Why? Because above the age of 3, even if the animal engaged in bestiality, the animal will not become sterile. Eis ve'kol hani tiyufta. So we'll say the Gemara then asked all the kashas that we raised before on Rabbi Yochanan, and what happens? So the Gemara shanila pchusa baskim oshanim, and the way Rabbi Yochanan ultimately again will say answered all of the questions is by distinguishing between an animal that is below 3 or less than 3 and an animal that is above 3. Tashma v'asaparos halu olol Hashem. So what about the following? You see over here that's what? In this case, by the Aron, they offered up the paros as an olah. So the Gemara says, not a problem. In Rabbi Yochanan's model, we're talking about animals that were less than 3 years old. But one second, animals less than 3 years old, maskif l'Rav Huna Breid Rav Nasan, imkein hainu vespim kol babayis pchusa mibas gimel shanim. So we'll say, one second, the pasuk says that the cows that they used to lead the wagon, I will say, left their young at home. Is an animal less than 3 years old capable of birthing, capable of giving birth? So the Gemara says, Upchusmevas Gimel Mikayolda, Vatanya, we learned, Para v'chamra mivas Gimel Vaday Lekoin, Mikan ve'ilech Safek. So we'll say, ultimately, again, this is talking about Bechar, that if you purchase a para or a chamor less than 3 years old, and the animal then gives birth after it reaches the age of 3, that is for sure a firstborn animal is given to the Kohen. If you purchase an older animal, Rabbi say, and the animal gives birth, it's a suffix whether or not that firstborn animal is a bechar. So what do you see from here? See, less than 3, the animal can't give birth. So how can you tell me that the cows that the plishtim sent were less than 3 years old? That's why the Jews were able to offer it up as karbanos. You can't say that because the pasuk clearly says that what? They left their young at home, which places them more than 3. Ella mechavarta tikid shanin lemeikara. Rather, Avoda, you have to say that the interpretation of the episode by the cows, by the plishtim, Avoda, was something different. That was a hora'ah shah. What does it mean, hora'ah shah? Hora'ah shah means at the end of the day, when the Jews saw the miracle that occurred with these cows, that they brought the aron by themselves without any human driver. They understood this was directed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We'll see more miracles associated with this Maisa in just a little bit, and therefore they felt justified ultimately because of the nature of the miraculous activity to offer up these animals as a carbon to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll say ultimately now the Gemara is going to talk about this story a little bit, but just understand we're still left with the Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon. We'll say just so you should know, in the case of paraduma, so what's Rabbi Eliezer paskins that you cannot purchase a paraduma ultimately again from an akum. We do not paskin that way. We paskin that one can go ahead and purchase a paraduma ultimately again from an akum. And again, for reasons we're not going to get into right now, the right to that, of course, is start with Dam ben Nesina, when in fact we have on record an episode when Jews did in fact go ahead and purchase a paraduma ultimately again from the Akum as well. All right, so let's go back there. So we'll say now we're going to talk about these cows, right? These cows that ultimately went ahead and brought back the Aron from the Plishtim. So we'll say, so the pasuk says, Vayisharna haparos baderech. Al derech beishemesh. So we'll say literally, vayasharna means what? They went straight. The Gemara darshins, my vayasharna Rabbi Yochanan Shlomo Meir sha'amru shira. So we'll say not only did the cows go straight, but what? They sang. They sang shira. Rav Zushar Artuvia Amar. So Rav Zushar Artuvia Amar Rav sheyashru pneim keneged Aron. Then when they sang, we'll say what did they do? When they sang, they faced directly to the Aron Kodesh. That's right. So the Gemara says, "Varmu shira or my shira amru." We'll say, what shira did they sing? Amar. So the Gemara says, "Amar Rabbi Yochanan Shlomo Meir, Az Yashir Moshe b'nei Yisrael." They sang the shira. Az Yashir. Rabbi Yochanan Didei Amar V'amartim Bayom Ahu Hodu LaHashem Kiru B'Shmo. We'll say, what did they sing? What did they sing? Excuse me. They sing ultimately again the Sukkim from Yeshaya. Right? Give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, call out in His name. Rav Shimon Lakish Amar Mizmora Yasma. They said the orphaned psalm. I will say, what is the orphaned psalm? So this the Gemara calls this is Tehillim Tzad Ches Tehillim 98. Mizmor Shiru LaHashem Shir Chadash Kiniflo Sasa. We'll say, why is it called the Mizmar Yasser? Because we'll say it is without attribution. That remember, again, there are many of the Kapitha Chavtilim that say Mizmar David, but ultimately, again, this one was without attribution, so it's called the orphaned psalm. This is what the cows sang. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Lazar Omer, Hashem Malach Yirgazu Amin. Others say that what did they sing? They sang ultimately again Hashem Malach Yigzomar from Tilim again, from Tilim Tzadik Test 99, right? Which will say not only say the whole capital, but this phrase Hashem is King. Ultimately again, nations will tremble, which will say is directly related to what exactly happened. Rosh Nachmani Amar Hashem Malach Geos Lavish. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafkar Amar Roni Ashi. So we'll say so actually Rabbi Yitzchak comes along and says no. They didn't say any capital from Tilim. Rather, again, they composed their own tefillah. We'll say, what did they say? Roni Hashita. Ultimately, again, literally, again, call out. We'll say, Shita means acacia wood, which was a reference ultimately, again, to the Aron itself. Hisnofafi barov hadrech. Literally, you are exalted in the abundance of your greatness, of your glory. Hamichushekes berik meizav. You are adorned with golden garments. Hamohulala b'dvir armon. You are again praised b'dvir armon. Literally, again, in the confines of your palace. Umifa'ara ba'ade adayim. And you wear many crowns. Rav Ashni masnila hadir Rabbi Yitzchak. Aha. So we'll say, actually, you know what? We'll stop over here with Rav Ashi. We'll pick up with this again. We'll see that the tefillah. So again, we've now seen the tefillah of the cows. In Meretz Hashem, we'll see how some of these tefillahs were used in other contexts as well. Sorry.
I don't think it's saying that they said the psukim. It must be like Shira, all the animals sing with their own language.